Thank you very much indeed for that introduction, and thank you also for the invitation. Gordon in particular, thank you, and it was really quite a nostalgic listen I've had over the last hour or so, seeing some of the colleagues I worked with at Hope Hospital, or Salford Royal Hospitals Trust, when I was a physician there. And I have to say, it was a huge privilege to be a physician where there were such fantastic surgeons, like Gordon, like John Banchowitz, like Miles Irvings, and so on and so forth. So it was really quite a trip down memory lane. Coffee's coming up, so don't slit your throat. Basically, you can recover from the shocks that I'm going to give you by just drinking a few coffees and talking to friends. I'm going to talk about the destruction of the NHS, the wanton and unnecessary destruction of the NHS. Most of the funding problems the NHS faces could actually be solved by the appropriate resolve and political will. But I'm going to talk about something rather narrowly focused, which is the political interference in the NHS that has actually made it very difficult, unnecessarily difficult, to deliver on the high standard of care that all of us wish for. John kindly mentioned NHS SOS, but that has been superseded by a book which actually is for sale and which I had nothing to do with, called NHS for Sale, and it's available in the bookshop outside. And just in case you think I'm sort of selling a product on behalf of somebody else, all the proceeds from the book go to something called Keep Our NHS Public. So that's NHS for Sale, to bring you up to speed on the iniquities that are being inflicted on the NHS. Those of you who have long memories will remember in 2010 the last election, in which a series of promises were made. No cutbacks in funding for the NHS, no hospital or service closures, and no further reorganisations. Well, of course, all of those promises were broken. As for cutbacks in funding, they happened very quickly indeed. From the Statistics Authority, the NHS expenditure fell in the first year of the coalition government. And subsequent, very minuscule growth in NHS expenditure fell short of the growth in cost of medical care. And these are just the data seen in another way. And during the Labour government, with whom I've had merry quarrels, they did actually increase the funding for the NHS in a very impressive way over a very long period of time. But 2010 onwards, that's come grinding to a halt. And for those of you who can't stand numbers and prefer pictures, here it is. That's NHS expenditure as a percentage of GDP. It's gone down at a time when the demands on the NHS increase year on year about 3, 4, 5%. No wonder we're in trouble. And actually, the fact we aren't in more trouble is a fantastic tribute to the people working in the NHS. As for no cuts or hospital closures, I won't take you through this dreary list. I actually have no huge problem about clinically driven reorganisations. I confess to the fact that I was intimately involved in the reorganisation of neuroscience in Greater Manchester, and that involved closing 2 neurosurgical units, and it involved closing 3 inpatient neurology units. So I have basically bringing all neuroscience, inpatient neuroscience services on one site. I have no problem with that because that was right for the patients and it was right for the development of the services. But there are other cuts and closures that are motivated by other, or driven by other considerations. The thing I want to focus on most is the third promise, which was no more reorganisations. The Tories in the lead up to the 2010 election said, no more top-down reorganisations of the NHS. And that was music to my ears. I have to say, in all the period that I had been a doctor for 37 years, we'd had almost continuous reorganisation. And that's rather like trying to write a file while someone's continuously reformatting the disk. The coalition was formed in May 2010, and they agreed we will stop the top-down reorganisation of the NHS that has got in the way of patient care. Alleluia to that. Within 6 weeks, a white paper was published mainly by the Tories, but colluded in by the Lib Dems, and it envisaged a reorganisation that the then chief executive of the NHS said was visible from outer space. The Lib Dems, for me, is particularly disappointing. It's often been said that all power corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolutely. But actually, impotence corrupts as well. And it was the years of impotence, it seemed to me, that corrupted the Lib Dems. But that's another story. What was offered to the NHS given that this is a surgical conference, is most kindly described as a Semtex suppository inserted into its rear, inserted into its rear end. And the man who inserted the suppository was Andrew Lansley, who shared a dream that had been had by the Tory party for 30 years, since Geoffrey Howe first voiced it sotto voce in the 1980s, which is basically of privatising the NHS. Now, I want to deal with 4 myths. First of all, the claim that the Health and Social Care Act was not about privatisation. Secondly, that actually, even if it was, it isn't happening. Thirdly, by the way, even if it was, and it is happening, it's actually not a bad thing. And finally, the genie's out of the bottle, what can you do? And I want to touch on those myths. What about the Health and Social Care Act? It wasn't sold, of course, as an act of privatisation. It was prompted, we're told, excuse me, because the NHS was a basket case. I'll deal with that in a second. It was about putting patients and GPs at the centre of the NHS. I'll deal with that. And it was about reducing bureaucracy. NHS a basket case? Well, in 2014, a Commonwealth Fund report, which was based on data obtained just before the Health and Social Care Act became operational, compared healthcare in 11 industrialised countries. Here we have them: Australia, Canada, France, Germany, Netherlands, New Zealand, Norway, Sweden, Switzerland, UK, and USA. And do you know what? The NHS came out top for quality of care, access, safety, value for money, and overall. The USA was bottom for all of those. NHS expenditure per head was the second lowest of all those 11 countries, just under $3,500. As you may imagine, the United States expenditure was $8,500. And did they get value for money? They did not. What are the other reasons? It was about putting patients at the centre of the NHS. There was a mantra: no decision about me without me. What's actually happened is total disenfranchisement of patients. Healthwatch, which is a group that's supposed to, as it were, hold the clinical commissioning groups to account, is totally toothless. And when it comes to a battle between Healthwatch and multinationals, it's not even pitchforks against Kalashnikovs. The rhetoric was about putting GPs at the centre of the budgetary control and commissioning. Again, in reality, GPs have been massively excluded. There's an interesting local case study. A month or so ago, with a great lot of pizzazz and hurrah, it was announced that the budget for health and social care for Greater Manchester would be devolved, so-called Manc-Devo. Do you know, none of the local medical committees, none of the GPs, none of the public knew anything about this. I am a member of something called Stockport NHS Watch, and we've tried to keep an eye on what's going on, and we knew nothing. Nor did many local MPs, nor, interestingly, did Andy Burnham, who's the Shadow Health Secretary. So this is the reality of democracy in the context of the Health and Social Care Act. This is where the decisions are really made. You can't afford to go there, so I'll tell you where it is. It's the Virgin Isles. The third reason for the Health and Social Care Act was it's about reducing bureaucracy. Well, actually, in 2010, there were 160 bodies managing and regulating the NHS. Now, because of all the tendering, etc., there are 443 bodies. I rest my case. So, of course, it was about something else. And it was about privatisation. And the privatisation plans were buried deep in a 346-page document, 3 times the size of the document that set up the NHS. And the key sections were Section 75, which said that all services must be put out to competitive tender. All services. Unless there are special considerations, which, of course, competition lawyers could make mincemeat of. The second was Section 165, which said that foundation trusts could earn up to 49% of their income on private patients. Oh, and by the way, all hospitals were to become foundation trusts. So, of course, it was about privatisation. But people said, yes, well, that's what they wanted to do. Don't get worried. You know, it hasn't happened. Mr. Hunt says, no, privatisation is not happening. And then he said, oh, and by the way, it's the GPs that's doing it. It's a bit like Billy Bunter, who said, you know, the cake wasn't stolen, and by the way, it was the other chap who stole it. It is happening, Between 2012 and 2014, only one of those years did we have the Health and Social Care Act, the proportion of the NHS out to private sector has increased by 40%. And a third of the contracts since April 2013 have gone out to the private sector. Now 18% of elective surgery is done privately. The pace, however, is quickening. There's been a sort of scorched earth policy in the run-up to the election, and in the last 2 months, Capita have scooped a £5 billion contract to oversee NHS commissioning. A private consortium has scooped a £700 million deal for elective surgery, and just last week in East Staffs, a service called Improving Lives has gone out to Virgin at £280 million. In the pipeline, there is a consortium of 4 CCGs in Staffordshire who are putting out £1.2 billion end-of-life and cancer care out to tender. NHS bidders have been excluded. In the early stage, Lockheed was in the frame. They make Hellfire missiles, and so they will be very economic when it comes to end-of-life care. But you haven't seen anything yet. The Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, which I could bore you to death over, actually would forbid protecting public services from the full force of competition. And we could talk about that if there's time. So, privatisation most certainly is happening, and it's going to happen faster and faster unless it's stopped. Some people say it's a good thing. Now, tonight we're having a debate, and this is a spoiler alert, because unless I change my views this afternoon, I'm going to say roughly the same thing this evening as I'm going to say in the next 5 minutes. So some of you might want to take a little vacation, as it were, if you're coming to tonight's debate. On the other hand, you may think what I have to say is worth hearing twice. You may think it's not even worth hearing once. So, people think that privatisation can lead to cheaper services, more innovative services, and put the NHS on its mettle. Cheaper? Quite the reverse, and I'll come to that in a second. Innovative, what I've heard this morning is the driver to improving patient care is actually a preoccupation about patients. And I don't think that drive exists in multinationals. I don't think that passion, your passion, is shared by Richard Branson. The idea also that we've got private competitors, that dozy old NHS, which the cheeky Mr. Hunt described as merely coasting when people are running around like throttled earwigs, that it'll put the NHS on its mettle. What actually does privatisation do? What is it doing now? First of all, it's disrupting. Endless tendering, as opposed to rolling out of contracts, is very disruptive, very consuming of managerial, clinical, and time. It's fragmenting. You give this bit of the service to Virgin, and that bit of the service to Lockheed, and that bit of the service to Circle. You've silly got the basis for a service that's not working together, but falling apart. And I was very interested in what you had to say about sepsis. If you're going to crack the problem of sepsis, you've got to have an integrated service that begins in people's homes and ends in the ICU. Cherry picking, of course. The private sector quite properly have a fiduciary duty to maximise their profits. Of course they do. So they're going to choose that bits of the service that will produce the maximum profit, and already making it very difficult for NHS existing services to balance the books. You've heard already the problems that foundation trusts are having to balance the books. Competition is, of course, anti-cooperation. I'm not going to tell those buggers down the road all my secrets. I'm not going to tell them about my data. I'm not going to work with them. They are our rivals, and so on and so forth. But it's worse than that. Actually, cooperation in the current health service may now be subject to challenge by competition lawyers. Let me give you a particular sickening, egregious example. Last year, Poole and Bournemouth hospitals decided they would work much better if they became a single trust and integrated. It was supported by the managers, the clinicians, the GPs out in the community, and the public at large. They had a big consultation. It would have saved £14 million a year, and one of the most exciting consequences was that they were able to promise consultant cover in A&E 24/7. It was about to go forward and Spire down the road and said, hang on a moment, this is anti-competitive. They brought the whole process grinding to a halt. It's cost millions of pounds in legal fees, and Poole Hospital is going deeper and deeper into debt. Thank you, Spire, for your contribution to patient care in Poole and Bournemouth. And of course, it's destabilizing. It also squanders your money and mine. The tendering processes are massively expensive, and I'm not talking about the time that clinicians waste and managers waste. I'm talking about additional commissioning people's salaries and so on and so forth. For example, there was a tender out for adult and older person services in Cambridgeshire. It eventually went to the NHS, for reasons I'll mention in a second. The tendering process cost between £1 and £10 million. I bet you'd love it if you had extra £1 and £10 million in your service. It is destabilizing. A trust that starts failing, as it were, to balance the books will somehow have to manage its decline, and that's a very expensive business. The transaction costs, once you've got all these contracts in place, are enormous. It's probably between now £5 and £10 billion a year squandered on transaction costs. Before the internal market, 5% of NHS funds were spent on administration management. It's now 16%, and it's heading towards the 31%, which is the proportion of healthcare money that's spent in the States on management. Of course, quite properly, private firms have to make a profit. So that's your taxes going into somebody else's pockets. And worse than that, that profit won't go back into the community as part of our general economy. 6 out of the 7 leading healthcare companies who get NHS contracts basically are tucking away their profits in that place, which you'll recognize from an earlier picture. It's worse still. We are all worried about lack of accountability or insufficient accountability in the health service. There have been examples, but actually the public health service is incredibly accountable compared with any private sector. First of all, commercial confidentiality will trump everything. There's no sharing of data, no obligation to publish your results, and they are currently protected from freedom of information requests. And it's only when the catastrophe breaks out into the street that someone blows the whistle. For example, Vanguard in Taunton, who were providing an ophthalmic surgery service, and eventually it was so bad it became visible without any proper monitoring. Behind the veil of secrecy, all sorts of things happen. And this veil is very thick indeed. A recent report, I quote from The Independent, "The NHS is struggling to monitor the safety and efficacy of its services outsourced to the private sector." And this is based on a report that was published 2 or 3 days ago by a think tank. 16% of the contracts managed, inverted commas, by the CCGs are now private. 15,000 contracts with the private sector. 199 of the CCGs who responded to the survey by the Centre for Health and Public Interest, 60% didn't record inspections, reviews, or were unable to say how many they'd done in the privately outsourced facilities. And 12% had not carried out any site inspections. Does that worry you? It worries me. One of the problems is that the private sector is extremely good at tendering. It runs rings round our managers and our clinicians who actually have been wasting their time focusing on patient care for all these years instead of on more important things like getting contracts. Margaret Hodge, scourge of the Public Accounts Committee, pointed out that Serco is good at getting contracts and hope at delivering services, and that has been very clear in some terrible instances. One of the ones you won't be familiar with is Circle. Circle in 2011-2012 promised to do 2 things: improve patient services and solve the financial problems of Hitchingbrook Hospital. Well, they've left in disgrace, they have made patient services worse, and they've left the hospital in a financial mess. But don't worry, they've got other fish to fry. That's not a big deal for them. It's only a big deal for the patients in Hitchingbrook. There is minimal or no commitment within the privatized sector to training, education, or the kind of research that you've been talking about this morning. There's no commitment to the overall health of the nation. Of course, it's the health of the bottom line, and that's totally proper, but there's no commitment to the health of the nation. Profit is the main motive. You need to shift product. You need to sometimes exploit the patient's lack of knowledge. If there are 2 treatments for a particular condition, and one of them brings a massive profit margin to your trust, and one of them brings only a modest one, there's a huge temptation to go for option A. There are perverse incentives to increase costs, lots and lots of unnecessary investigations. Hence, the fact that 18% of the GDP in the United States is spent on healthcare, delivering very poor healthcare. And ultimately, to me, the most worrying, and I wrote about it decades ago, well, ages ago, a decade ago, in a book called Hippocratic Oaths, is the deprofessionalization of healthcare workers. Increasingly, there will be inevitable loyalty to the firm rather than to the professional ethos. So, privatization a good thing? I leave you to judge. The final thing is, perhaps it can't be stopped. The genie's out of the bottle. Well, actually, I think it can. I want to give you two examples. There was an £800 million contract to run older person adult services in Cambridge. And it looked as if it was going to go to a private consortium. There was a huge outcry, and it eventually went to the NHS, after between £1 and £10 million had been spent on the tendering process. And there's an interesting story coming from Nottingham, and in fact it's covered by the Independent this morning, although it's been rumbling on. The dermatologists were told by the trust that they had to work in a new facility that was going to be run by Circle. They decided they weren't going to be encircled, they were going to slip the Circle noose, and 5 out of the 6 dermatologists disappeared down the road to Derby. And that is possible because there are more posts for consultant dermatologists than there are consultant dermatologists. The only poor old dermatologist who remains now in Nottingham is the academic, who can't move because that's where the university is. What about generally can it be stopped? Well, the election has been mentioned, and I think we do have a choice. The Tories are committed to continuing to privatising the NHS. Labour, after doing things that started the process of privatisation on a grand scale, are actually chastened. They've had a Damascene conversion, and I believe them. The Greens are against privatisation. The Scottish National Party, I have to say, Nicola Sturgeon may be our own protection against Virgin. But they are totally opposed to privatisation, and in 2004 they reversed the internal market, as they did in New Zealand, by the way. Plaid Cymru likewise. As for UKIP, it always amuses me. You need to check their policy on a daily or an hourly basis, but that's confidential. I don't want to go out of this room. And I mentioned the Labour manifesto. This is not a party political thing, but I just mentioned that the Labour Party are committed to repealing the market, scrapping Section 75 regulations, making the NHS preferred provider, ensuring the NHS is protected from TTIP, placing tougher controls on hospital earnings from private patients, and most of all, restoring the duty of the Secretary of State for Health. Because one aspect of the Health and Social Care Act, which I haven't mentioned, is that it removed the duty of the Secretary of State for Health to provide comprehensive health care free at the point of need to merely promoting comprehensive health care at the point of need. And you know how Jeremy Hunt has promoted it. He's used his index finger. That's how you promote health. And you name and shame GPs. You describe people in hospitals as coasting and et cetera, et cetera. You make a series of useless and disruptive and ignorant interventions. That's what promoting the NHS or whatever consists of, as opposed to being responsible for providing it. There is no longer any direct accountability between the NHS and the executive. That's one of the key pits of the Health and Social Care Act, and that too would be repealed if Labour were in power. And I guess we can fight it on the ground. I have to tell you, it's in Stockport. It's been a very, very dismal business. Trying to find out what's going in the tendering process. What are the private interests of the CCG board membership? Do you know 3 of the board members of our CCG are KPMG alumni? What's KPMG got to healthcare? I can tell you what it's got to do with healthcare, and I don't need to spell it out to you. What do the winners offer when they won a bid? How will the delivery be monitored? What sanctions if they fail? How are the staff to be treated? One big trick that Circle did was, having taken over Hitchingbrook Hospital, they then sacked a lot of staff or reduced their terms and conditions and so on and so forth, as a result of which patient care suffered. How will the public know what's going on? The role of the media, it's been absolutely pathetic. It's been unbelievably awful. They have done very little to inform the citizens of this country of things that impact most directly on their interests. So I hope that puts a bit of fire in your belly, because we don't want to let them get away with it. They've done their best to actually tear apart the NHS and sell it off to Richard Branson and other characters, but this is probably our last opportunity to stop it. Thank you.